There is a chapter in the Bible that experienced pastors skip, theology professors summarize in 2 sentences, and preachers avoid as if it were a trap. That chapter is Romans 9. Not because it is obscure or difficult to read. The text is straightforward, dense, and powerful. The problem is precisely what it says. Romans 9 places on the table a truth that modern Christendom does not want to face. God chooses. God elects. God has mercy on whom he will have mercy, and hardens whom he will harden. This is not a Calvinist interpretation. This is what the text says, literally, without metaphor, without figure of speech. And it is precisely for this reason that the modern church is terrified to open this chapter before a congregation. We live in an era in which Christianity has been shaped by consumer culture. The believer has become a customer. Preaching has become a product, and a product must please. In such a logic, any doctrine that places man in a position of absolute dependence on God, without merit, without prior decision, without anything that justifies the divine choice beyond God's own sovereign will, is a dangerous doctrine for the religious market. John Calvin, the reformer of Geneva, was one of the few in church history who did not blink before Romans 9. He preached that chapter, commented on it line by line, and softened nothing. For Calvin, fleeing from Romans 9 was fleeing from God. It was to prefer a domesticated, predictable God, dependent on human will over the living God of the Scriptures, who sovereignly governs all things, including salvation. The question that remains is, why does today's church fear a chapter that the church of the 16th century preached openly? The answer involves several factors: theological, cultural, and even financial. Theology was gradually replaced by motivation. Doctrine was exchanged for experience. And Romans 9, with its uncompromising language about divine sovereignty, simply does not fit into a 45-minute service designed to offend no one. But there is a high price to pay for this silence. When the church omits Romans 9, it does not merely fail to teach a text, it begins to preach a different God. A God who desires to save but cannot without human cooperation. A God who does everything he can but depends on man's free will to accomplish his purposes. And that God, it must be said, is not the God of Paul, not the God of Calvin, and most importantly, not the God of the Bible. Few figures in the history of Christianity have been so misquoted, so misinterpreted, and so misrepresented as John Calvin. Mention his name in evangelical circles, and the reactions range from discomfort to open hostility. Calvin is the one who believes God creates people for hell. Calvin took away man's free will. Calvin turned God into a tyrant. These phrases circulate, they are repeated, and they almost never come accompanied by a serious reading of any work he wrote. So, let us look at what Calvin actually taught, without caricature, without ideological filter, without the summary of someone who has never opened the institutes of the Christian religion. Calvin began from a point that no serious Christian should contest. Man, after the fall, is dead in his trespasses and sins, not weakened, not wounded, dead. And a dead man chooses nothing. He does not incline toward God. He does not seek God. Paul had already said this in Romans 3, "There is none who seeks after God, there is not even one." Calvin took that statement seriously. If man does not seek God by nature, and if some men come to faith, then something external to man must explain that difference. That something, for Calvin, was the sovereign grace of God. A grace that does not merely invite, but that effectively regenerates, transforms, and guarantees the salvation of the one God chose. Election, for Calvin, is not a cold philosophical theory. It is a doctrine of consolation. It is the assurance that salvation does not rest on the instability of human will, but on the eternal and immutable decree of God. Calvin did not preach election to produce arrogance in the elect. He preached election to produce radical humility. If you were saved, it was not because you were smarter, more sensitive, more receptive than your neighbor. It was because God, out of pure mercy, acted in you in a way that depended on nothing in you. And predestination, Calvin defined it as the eternal decree of God by which he determined what he wished to do with each human being. Some are ordained to eternal life. That is election. Others are left in the condemnation they deserved for their sins. That is what Calvin called reprobation. And here is the point the modern church cannot swallow. Calvin did not invent this. He read Romans 9, read Ephesians 1, read John 6, read the entire gospel, and concluded that the Bible teaches exactly this. What most people call extreme Calvinism is, in reality, nothing more than a literal reading of texts the church prefers to allegorize, soften, or ignore. Calvin was not a theologian who enjoyed controversy for its own sake. He was a pastor who believed that the people of God deserved to hear the complete truth of the Scriptures, including the uncomfortable parts. Especially the uncomfortable parts, and that is why Romans 9 was central to Calvin's thinking, not as a theological curiosity, but as the foundation of grace. If God chooses sovereignly, then no one can boast. If no one can boast, all glory belongs to God. And if all glory belongs to God, salvation is exactly what the Bible says it is: gift, grace, mercy, and not achievement, merit, or a human decision well made on a Sunday afternoon. If there is a passage in Romans 9 that causes more discomfort than any other, it is what Paul writes about Jacob and Esau. It is not an isolated verse, not a phrase taken out of context. It is an argument constructed with surgical precision to eliminate any possibility of man claiming participation in his own election. Paul goes straight to the point, without detours, without qualifications. The text reads, "For the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth. It was said unto her, The elder shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated." Romans 9 verses 11 through 13. Read carefully. Paul is not saying that God foresaw that Jacob would be better and therefore chose him. Paul is saying the opposite. The choice was made before any action, before any merit, before any human criterion could come into play. And the reason declared by the text itself is explicit, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works. In other words, God was deliberate in choosing beforehand precisely so that no one could say the choice was based on something in the chosen one. Calvin identified in this point the heart of the doctrine of election. It is not merely that God chose Jacob, it is that God chose Jacob in a way that makes any human explanation for that choice impossible. Jacob was not more righteous, he was not more obedient. In the Genesis narrative, Jacob is deceitful, manipulative, full of flaws. Esau, on the other hand, is a simple man, hard-working, honest in his own way. If God chose on the basis of visible character, Esau would have the advantage. But it was not so. Election did not follow human logic. It followed the sovereign will of God. And here is the point the modern church cannot accept. If election is not based on merit, on foreknowledge of faith, on an advanced decision by man, then man has nothing in which to boast regarding his own salvation. Nothing. Zero. And that deeply wounds human pride, including religious pride. Because there is an enormous difference between saying, God saved me because I chose him, and saying, God saved me despite my not having chosen, not having deserved, and not having contributed anything whatsoever. Popular modern theology has built a narrative in which God does 99% of the work and man does 1%. That final little decision, that moment of accepting Jesus into the heart. It seems like a small thing. But that 1% changes everything. Because if it is man who takes the decisive step, then the reason you are saved and your neighbor is not resides in you, in your sensitivity, your openness, your decision, and that, however small it may seem, is merit. It is human glory, disguised as humility. Paul leaves no such space open. The example of Jacob and Esau closes the door. Election took place before birth, before any work, before any criterion that could be attributed to the elect. Calvin called this unconditional election. Unconditional because it is not conditioned on anything in man, but solely on the free and sovereign will of God. The discomfort this text generates in modern churches is a theological thermometer. When a congregation cannot hear Romans 9 without revolting, it is not a sign that the doctrine is wrong. It is a sign that human pride is still on the throne where only God should be. After the example of Jacob and Esau, Paul goes still deeper, as if he knew the reader was already uncomfortable, as if he anticipated the objection forming in the mind of the one reading. He introduces one of the most powerful and most disturbing images in the entire letter to the Romans, the image of the potter and the clay, and with it a question that has echoed throughout the entire history of Christian theology. Does God have sovereign authority over the creature? The text is direct. Paul writes in Romans 9, verses 20 through 23, "Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, Why hast thou made me thus? Hath not the potter power over the clay, of the same lump to make one vessel unto honor, and another unto dishonor? What if God, willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long-suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had afore prepared unto glory?" Read that passage carefully. Paul is not philosophizing. He is not raising a hypothesis. He is answering a real objection with an authority that leaves no room for negotiation. The image of the potter and the clay is not decorative. It is theological and intentional. The potter does not ask the clay's permission to shape it. The potter does not consult the clay about the form it will take. The potter has authority over the clay simply because the clay is clay and the potter is the potter. Calvin meditated deeply on this image. For him, it revealed something fundamental about the relationship between creator and creature that modern theology has completely lost sight of. We live in an age in which God has been repositioned as a being who desperately desires human approval, who does everything to please, who adapts his plans according to the decisions of men. But the God of Romans 9 does not fit that description. The God of Romans 9 is sovereign over the clay. He shapes according to his will. He prepares vessels for honor and vessels for dishonor. And the distinction is not in the clay, but in the potter. Here the modern church stalls completely, because accepting this implies accepting a God who is not subordinate to human expectations, a God who owes no account of his choices. A God who acts for the glory of his own name, and not primarily for the comfort, happiness, or satisfaction of human beings. And this God is too immense, too free, too sovereign to fit within the molds of contemporary evangelicalism, which has transformed faith into an experience centered on the well-being of the individual. But it is necessary to go beyond the discomfort and ask, what is Paul actually saying with the vessels of wrath and the vessels of mercy? Calvin understood that the vessels of mercy are those God chose to save, prepared beforehand for glory. The vessels of wrath are those left in the condemnation that all of humanity deserves because of sin. And here is a detail that most critics of Calvin completely ignore: the asymmetry between the two cases. Paul says that the vessels of mercy were prepared by God for glory, but regarding the vessels of wrath, the text says they were prepared for destruction, without attributing that preparation to God in the same direct way. Calvin noticed this asymmetry and took it seriously. The condemnation of the reprobate is just because all deserve condemnation. What is gratuitous, what is pure mercy, what finds no explanation in human merit, is the salvation of the elect. In other words, no one receives what they do not deserve when condemned, but no one deserves what they receive when saved. The right question is not, why does God condemn some? All deserve condemnation. The right question, the question that should bring us to our knees, is why does God save anyone? And the only answer the Bible offers is, for the glory of His own name, for the riches of His own mercy, for the sovereignty of His own will. The church that is terrified of Romans 9 is a church that deep down cannot endure a God like this. Too great, too free, too sovereign. It prefers a smaller God, domesticated, predictable, dependent on human cooperation. But that smaller God saves no one, because a God who depends on man to accomplish his purposes is not God. He is merely a superior power waiting for the clay to decide what shape it wants to take. If you have followed this study this far, you have probably felt the discomfort growing. And that discomfort is exactly what Paul anticipated. The apostle knew the human mind. He knew that in presenting the absolute sovereignty of God in election, choosing Jacob and rejecting Esau before birth, shaping vessels of honor and vessels of dishonor according to his own will, an inevitable objection would arise. And Paul did not conceal it. He placed it in the text, in plain words. Romans 9 verse 19, Thou wilt say then unto me, Why doth he yet find fault? For who hath resisted his will? This is the most honest objection that exists in the face of the doctrine of divine sovereignty. If God chooses sovereignly, if God hardens whom he will harden, if no human purpose can resist the divine will, then how can God hold man accountable for what God himself determined? It seems an irresolvable logical contradiction. And it is precisely for this reason that the modern church prefers never to reach this verse, because upon reaching it, a response must be given. And Paul's response is not what anyone would expect. What would most preachers do before this objection? They would soften it. They would retreat. They would say something like, well, God actually foresaw the free choices of men and based his election on that. Or else, the sovereignty of God and the free will of man are like two rails of a railway that never meet. It is a mystery we cannot resolve. These responses exist to accommodate the listener, to avoid conflict, to keep the peace in the congregation. But these responses are not Paul's response. Paul's response is disconcerting in its frankness. Verse 20, Nay, but, O man, who art thou that repliest against God? Period. Paul does not resolve the philosophical tension. Paul does not offer an explanation that satisfies human logic. Paul repositions the questioner. Rather than answering the question on the terms in which it was asked, Paul exposes the false presupposition behind it. The presupposition that man has the right to demand of God a justification that makes sense to the human mind. Calvin understood this with great depth. For the Reformer, Paul's response is not an evasion. It is a fundamental theological correction. The problem is not in the doctrine of divine sovereignty. The problem lies in the arrogance of the creature who assumes that the Creator owes it an explanation. When man asks, why does God still find fault if he determined everything? He is, without realizing it, placing himself as judge of God. He is assuming that his own logic is the standard by which divine acts must be evaluated. And Paul demolishes that presupposition with a single question, Who are you, O man? But there is an even deeper layer here that must be stated. Human responsibility and divine sovereignty are not contradictory in the Bible. They are complementary. Man acts according to his own will, his own desires, his own inclinations. The fact that God governs sovereignly over all things does not turn man into a robot without will. The wicked man acts wickedly because he wants to, because his nature is wicked. God does not force man to sin against man's will. Man sins because it is what he wants to do. The responsibility is real. The guilt is real. And at the same time, God's sovereignty over all of this is also real. What the human mind cannot accommodate is the coexistence of these two realities. And faced with this difficulty, the modern church made a decision. It sacrificed the sovereignty of God to preserve human responsibility. It built a theology in which God is limited by man's will so that man can be held accountable. But Paul does not make that choice. Paul maintains both realities in the text, the absolute sovereignty of God and the real responsibility of man. And when the tension becomes unbearable for the reader, Paul does not resolve the tension. Paul questions the reader. This is what the modern church cannot endure. It cannot endure a text that does not resolve all questions in a manner satisfactory to the human mind. It cannot endure a God who is greater than our capacity to explain him. It cannot endure Paul's response, which at bottom is this: there are questions the creature has no authority to ask the Creator in the manner in which it is asking them. And theological maturity begins precisely where intellectual arrogance ends, at the moment when the creature falls silent before the magnitude of the Creator and says, with Job, "I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know." There is an interesting phenomenon in Brazilian and worldwide evangelicalism. The vast majority of Christians who attend an evangelical church today have never heard the word Arminianism. They have never studied Jacob Arminius, the Dutch theologian of the 17th century, who systematized the doctrine of free will in opposition to Calvinism. They have never read the Synod of Dort, never encountered the 5 points of the historical controversy between Calvinists and Arminians, and yet they think and speak exactly as a convinced Arminian. How did this happen? The answer lies in a slow, silent, and nearly invisible process of theological substitution that took place over decades within evangelical churches. It was not a deliberate decision of any council, not an official change of confession of faith. It was a gradual erosion, fed by hymnals, by praise songs, by motivational preaching, by mass evangelism, and by a Christian culture that increasingly shaped itself according to the logic of the market and of self-help. Think of the phrases you hear every week in an average evangelical church. God is waiting for your decision. Today is the day for you to open your heart to Jesus. God has done his part. Now it depends on you. God will not force your will. These phrases seem harmless. They even seem pious, but each one carries embedded within it a theology. The theology that salvation is a partnership between God and man, in which God offers and man decides, in which the final step, the determining step, belongs to human will. This is the essence of Arminianism. And it is so deeply embedded in the language, the culture, and the practice of contemporary churches that most Christians do not even realize they are professing a historic theological position every time they sing certain hymns or repeat certain phrases in the service. Calvin and the Reformers arrived at a radically different and biblical conclusion. Natural man, unregenerate man, has no capacity to choose God because his will is enslaved to sin. John 6:44 is clear. No man can come to me except the Father which hath sent me draw him. It is not that man can come, but prefers not to come. It is that man cannot come unless the Father first acts sovereignly and effectually, regenerating the heart and liberating the will so that man comes. Faith is not the cause of regeneration, it is its fruit. But this truth has disappeared from modern churches for very practical reasons. The mass evangelism of the 20th century, especially the model popularized by evangelists such as Charles Finney in the 19th century, who, incidentally, explicitly denied total depravity and unconditional election, transformed the human decision into the center of the conversion process. The altar call, the raise your hand if you want to accept Jesus, the sinner's prayer as the decisive act of salvation, all of this built a culture in which man is at the center of the salvation narrative. And when man is at the center, Romans 9 becomes a problem, because Romans 9 removes man from the center and places God there. And a church built around the human decision has no theological structure to absorb a chapter that denies the human decision is the determining factor in salvation. The practical result is a Christendom in which people have an exceedingly high view of themselves and an exceedingly low view of God, in which salvation is a product that God offers and man purchases with the currency of decision, in which the church functions as a point of sale and the preacher as a salesman, and in which any theology that threatens this model, such as the absolute sovereignty of God in Romans 9, is automatically classified as cold, arrogant, or loveless. Calvin would say that genuine love for the congregation is exactly the opposite. It is having the courage to preach the complete text, including the parts that wound human pride, because it is the complete truth that liberates. A church that omits Romans 9 so as not to discomfort its members is not loving its members. It is depriving them of the true God and keeping them comfortable before a theological idol built in the image and likeness of the culture of free will. If the example of Jacob and Esau was already uncomfortable, Paul goes still deeper in Romans 9 with a second example, and this time he chooses a figure no one would expect to encounter in a discussion about the grace of God. Paul chooses Pharaoh, the tyrant of Egypt, the man who enslaved Israel for generations, the man whose heart was hardened by God. And with this example, Paul establishes something the modern church is completely incapable of preaching without trembling, that God acts sovereignly in history, including through wicked men, including through the hardening of hearts, and that the ultimate purpose of all of this is the glory of God's own name. The text of Romans 9 verses 17 and 18 is devastating in its clarity. For the Scripture saith unto Pharaoh, even for this same purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth. Therefore hath he mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will he hardeneth. Paul is citing Exodus 9:16, a word God directed to Pharaoh. And the declaration is absolute. God did not merely permit Pharaoh to harden his own heart. God says he raised him up. He positioned him in that specific place in history for a specific purpose, the demonstration of divine power and the proclamation of God's name throughout all the earth. Calvin faced this text with the seriousness it demands. For the reformer, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart was not God's reaction to Pharaoh's behavior. It was a sovereign act of God within his eternal plan for the history of redemption. God was not caught off guard by Pharaoh's stubbornness. God did not attempt to soften Pharaoh's heart and fail. God acted with determination and a clear purpose, and that purpose was the glorification of his own name through the plagues, the deliverance of Israel, and the destruction of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea. But here is where the discussion goes still deeper, because the Pharaoh of Exodus hardens his own heart in several passages, and in other passages it is God who hardens Pharaoh's heart. And this tension, rather than being a problem for Reformed theology, is exactly what Calvin would expect to find. Man acts according to his own nature. Pharaoh was a proud, idolatrous man who recognized no authority above himself. He hardened his heart because it was what his corrupted nature naturally did, and at the same time God governed sovereignly over the entire process for his own ends. Both things are true, simultaneously. without contradiction for God, though with irresolvable tension for the human mind. What Paul wants the reader to understand through the example of Pharaoh goes beyond individual election. He wants to show that God acts in all of history with sovereign purposes, not only in the salvation of individuals, but in the empires that rise and fall, in the rulers who ascend and are destroyed, in the events that appear chaotic and random to human eyes, but which are perfectly within God's providential government. Pharaoh was not an obstacle to God's plan. He was an instrument of God's plan. An instrument who acted voluntarily according to his own wickedness, and who at the same time fulfilled a determined role in the drama of redemption. The modern church cannot preach this because it has built a theology in which God is constantly reacting to human decisions, trying to bring about good from the chaos man generates, a God who roots for his creatures but does not control the outcomes, a God who suffers over the wrong choices of men and does the best he can within the limitations that human free will imposes. This God is emotionally accessible. He is relatable. He is the God who appears in American Christian films. But he is not the God who hardened Pharaoh's heart so that his name would be declared throughout all the earth. And here is the deepest consequence of this example for the Christian faith. If God governs sovereignly over Pharaoh, over empires, over the hardening of hearts and over the vessels of wrath, then nothing in history is outside his control. No human wickedness surprises God. No evil that befalls his people is outside his governance. And this, far from being a cold and frightening doctrine, is in reality one of the deepest sources of comfort for the genuine believer, because it means that the God you worship is not trying to manage a situation that has gotten out of control. It means that the God you worship governs over everything, over the pharaohs of your life, over the hardenings you do not understand, over the circumstances that seem to contradict the love of God, and that all of this, in some way that eternity alone will often reveal, is being used for the glory of his name. Calvin did not preach the sovereignty of God to produce fatalism. He preached it to produce worship, so that the people of God would know they were in the hands of a God who does not improvise, does not react, is not surprised, and does not fail. A God who raised up Pharaoh, who delivered Israel, who declared his name throughout all the earth, and who is doing the same thing today, in every detail of history, in every life he chose for himself before the foundation of the world. We have arrived at a topic that demands honesty, not merely theological honesty, but honesty about what is happening inside churches, inside ministries, inside the heads and hearts of contemporary Christian leaders. Because the silence about Romans 9 is not merely theological ignorance. In many cases, it is a deliberate choice, and that choice has very concrete, very human, and very revealing motivations about the state of Christianity in the 21st century. The first and most obvious reason is the fear of the congregation. Every pastor who has ever stood at a pulpit knows there is a constant tension between preaching what the text says and preaching what people want to hear. This tension is not new. Paul was already warning Timothy about it in 2 Timothy 4:3. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears. But this tension has never been as intense as it is today, in an era in which a dissatisfied believer can simply pick up his phone, search for another church on social media, and migrate to a different community without any relational cost. Predestination and unconditional election are doctrines that directly confront human pride. And wounded pride, in the context of the contemporary church, translates into complaints, divisions, departures of members, and, what for many leaders is the final argument, a drop in tithes. It is not pleasant to state it this bluntly, but it is the reality. Churches are organizations with bills to pay. Pastors are leaders who need to keep their communities united and functioning. And a serious expository preaching of Romans 9 has the potential to generate enough conflict to shake entire structures. The second reason is the social media phenomenon. Never in the history of the church has a preacher been so exposed to immediate public judgment as today. A sermon on election and predestination can be recorded, edited, taken out of context, and go viral with hostile comments within hours. And in a culture where digital reputation is a ministerial asset, where followers, views, and engagement have become metrics of spiritual success, the risk of preaching unpopular doctrines is immense. The pastor who preaches Romans 9 faithfully may wake up on Monday morning with his name associated with terms like arrogant, loveless, extremist, or heretic in the comments of some video someone clipped and posted out of context. This creates a perverse and powerful incentive for silence, not a confessed silence. No pastor goes to the microphone and says, "Today I am going to avoid Romans 9 because I am afraid of social media." The silence disguises itself. It becomes an excessive emphasis on other themes. It becomes a sermon series that never arrives at that chapter. It becomes a quick and vague comment about the sovereignty of God that deepens nothing and commits no one. The doctrine is not denied. It is simply never taught with the depth and clarity the text demands. The third reason is the most structural of all: Christian marketing. Contemporary evangelicalism, especially in Brazil and the United States, has been profoundly shaped by church growth strategies that prioritize accessibility, inclusion, and positive emotional experience. The church for people who don't like church model, popularized in recent decades, was built on the presupposition that the gospel must be presented in a way that does not offend, does not constrain, and does not generate immediate discomfort. The idea is to remove all barriers so that people come in, and then, gradually, to deepen the content. The problem is that gradually never arrives. Because when an entire community was built on the premise that the gospel should not discomfort, introducing Romans 9 at a later stage becomes structurally impossible. The foundation was built on theological sand, on a God who does not offend, who does not constrain, who has no sovereignty over human will. And when you try to build on that foundation a doctrine that places God absolutely at the center and man absolutely dependent, the entire structure collapses. Calvin saw this danger with clarity in his own time. He knew that the natural tendency of the religious flesh is to build a God in its own image, a comfortable, predictable God who confirms our choices rather than precedes them. And he knew that the remedy for this idol was not pastoral softness. It was the word of God preached without cuts, without edits, without chapter 9 of Romans left out, because the ministry's marketing could not accommodate it. The pastor who has the courage to preach Romans 9 faithfully today is doing something that goes against every incentive in the system, against the fear of the congregation, against the logic of social media, against the numerical growth model that dominates contemporary ecclesial thinking. And it is precisely for this reason that such a pastor is rare. And it is precisely for this reason that the silence about Romans 9 is not an accident, it is a symptom. A symptom of a church that has substituted prophetic courage for reputation management, that has traded faithfulness to the text for faithfulness to the audience, that has learned to fear man far more than it fears God. And in the end, the question that remains for every Christian leader is simple and devastating. Do you preach so that people will know the God of the Bible, or do you preach so that people will like you? Because in Romans 9, these two motivations cannot coexist. We have arrived at the topic that changes the tone of the conversation. Up to this point, we have passed through the difficult texts, through the doctrines that discomfort, through the reasons the church flees from Romans 9. But now we need to ask a different question, not what the doctrine of election disturbs, but what it preserves. Because unconditional election, the absolute sovereignty of God in salvation, is not merely a doctrine that affronts human pride. It is a doctrine that protects fundamental truths without which the gospel ceases to be the gospel. The first thing the doctrine of election preserves is radical grace. And when we say radical grace, we are not using the word radical as a rhetorical intensifier. We are using it in the literal sense, grace that goes to the root, grace that finds no point of support in man, grace that is completely unilateral, completely undeserved, completely inexplicable in human terms. Paul is precise in Ephesians 2:8 and 9. For by grace are ye saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. This text is frequently quoted, but its depth is only fully understood when placed alongside Romans 9. If salvation has any humanly determinative component, if man's decision is the final factor that seals or prevents salvation, then grace is not radical, it is partial. It is a grace that did 99% of the work, but needed the human 1% to complete itself, and that 1%, however small it seems, contaminates everything. Because it means there is something in the saved that is not in the lost, a greater sensitivity, a greater openness, a better decision made, and that, by definition, is merit. It is human glory. It is exactly what Paul said does not exist in salvation. Unconditional election preserves radical grace because it removes that 1% entirely. Salvation is 100% of God, from beginning to end, from election in eternity to glorification in the future eternity. Man contributes nothing that was not first given by God. The very faith with which man believes is the gift of God, not a natural capacity of man that God made use of, but a sovereign gift planted in the heart by the Holy Spirit in regeneration. This is radical grace. And without the doctrine of election, this radical grace slips through the fingers and is transformed into a grace that ultimately depends on man to function. The second thing the doctrine of election preserves is total humility. And here we are speaking of a humility that goes far beyond outward behavior. We are speaking of a structural humility, a humility that is embedded in the very understanding the believer has of himself and of his salvation. When you understand that you were saved not because you were more sensitive, more open, more receptive, or more intelligent than your unsaved neighbor, when you understand that the only reason you are in Christ and the other is not, is the sovereign mercy of God. This produces a humility that no spiritual discipline can artificially manufacture. Calvin observed that most of the spiritual pride he saw in the churches of his time had its roots in an incorrect view of salvation. When man believes he contributed something determinative to his own salvation, he inevitably develops a sense of superiority toward the unsaved. Not necessarily in a conscious or declared way, but structurally embedded in the narrative he tells about himself. I opened my heart. I made the decision. I accepted. Each of those I's carries within it a seed of pride that eventually produces judgment, arrogance, and a lack of compassion for the lost. The doctrine of election cuts that root. When you know there is nothing in you that explains why you are saved and the other is not, when you know you could easily be the vessel of wrath if not for the undeserved mercy of God, you look upon the lost not with superiority, but with a deep compassion and a gratitude that never runs dry. You do not glory in your salvation as an achievement. You prostrate yourself before the mercy that made it possible. The third thing the doctrine of election preserves, and perhaps the most pastoral of all, is the assurance of the believer. And here we arrive at a point the modern church, paradoxically, wastes by fleeing from Romans 9. because the assurance election offers is one that no other doctrine can provide with the same solidity. If your salvation depends in any measure on your will, your decision, your faith as an autonomous act, then your assurance depends on the stability of your will. And whoever knows his own will knows it is unstable, oscillating, capable of great enthusiasms one day and great despondency the next. A salvation anchored in human will is a salvation that can be undone by that same human will. And this produces, inevitably, a Christian life marked by insecurity, by constant doubt, by the need to reaffirm the decision repeatedly in order to feel saved again. Unconditional election resolves this once and for all. If God chose before the foundation of the world, if Christ died specifically for his elect, if the Holy Spirit effectually regenerates those the Father gave to the Son, then salvation is anchored not in the unstable will of man, but in the eternal and immutable decree of God. John 10:28 and 29 echoes Romans 9 with precision. And I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish, neither shall any man pluck them out of my hand. My Father, which gave them me, is greater than all, and no man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hand. No one, no circumstance, no weakness, no fall, no instability of human will. This is the assurance election produces, not the assurance of presumption, not the idea that I can live as I please because I am elect, but the assurance of grace, the certainty that he who began a good work in me will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ, not because I am sufficiently faithful, but because he is faithful when I am not. Calvin did not preach election to produce arrogant and fatalistic people. He preached election to produce people who are profoundly grateful, profoundly humble, and profoundly secure in God. A church that flees from Romans 9 is not protecting its members from discomfort. It is depriving them of the most radical grace, the most genuine humility, and the most solid assurance the gospel has to offer. We have reached the end, and the end demands total honesty. Not the comfortable honesty that concludes with everyone feeling good, but the honesty that Romans 9 itself demands of anyone who takes it seriously. Because after everything we have seen in this series, the election of Jacob and Esau, the vessels of wrath and of mercy, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, Paul's objection and his disconcerting response, the calculated silence of modern churches, one question remains, and that question is the most important of all. Does the modern church flee from Romans 9 because it does not believe in a sovereign God, or because it has never truly studied Romans 9? The answer, after everything we have seen, is that both are true, and they feed each other in a cycle that explains much of the current state of evangelicalism. Let us begin with the second part, the problem of study. The vast majority of evangelical Christians today have never been exposed to a serious expository preaching of Romans 9. They have never heard a pastor go through the text verse by verse, face the objections Paul himself raises, explain the historical context of the election of Israel, connect Exodus with Pauline theology, and arrive at the end with an application that does not soften what the text says. It simply has never happened, and what is never taught can never be believed, loved, or defended. This means there is an enormous number of sincere Christians, people who love God and take the faith seriously, who flee from Romans 9 not out of conscious theological rebellion, but out of genuine ignorance. No one has ever sat them before this text and said, "Let us read this together. Let us understand what Paul is saying. Let us face the discomfort this text generates and discover the God it reveals." If that teaching had occurred consistently, courageously, pastorally, much would be different. But there is the first part of the question, and it is more serious. Because there are leaders, pastors, theologians, seminary professors, who know Romans 9, who have read Calvin, who have studied the institutes, the commentaries, the history of the Synod of Dort, who know exactly what the text says, and who systematically choose not to preach it, not out of ignorance, but out of a conscious decision that this text is too dangerous, too unpopular, too incompatible with the ministry model they have built. This second group is the most troubling, because when a leader knows the truth and chooses to silence it for reasons of convenience, whether the fear of the congregation, whether the logic of social media, whether the ministerial marketing model we discussed earlier, he is not merely omitting a doctrine. He is making an active choice to present to his people a God smaller than the God of the Bible. And that has eternally serious consequences. Calvin wrote in the Institutes that the true knowledge of God and the true knowledge of man are inseparable. You cannot rightly know man without rightly knowing God, and you cannot rightly know God while avoiding the texts that reveal his absolute sovereignty. A church that never faces Romans 9 is a church that by definition has a distorted view of God, a God amputated of his sovereignty, reduced to a powerful but dependent being, generous but limited, loving but impotent before human will. And here is the deepest irony in all of this discussion. The church that flees from Romans 9 to preserve the comfort of its members ends up producing exactly the opposite of what it intended. It produces insecure Christians because their salvation depends on the stability of their own will. It produces proud Christians because they believe they contributed something determinative to their own salvation. It produces fragile Christians because their God is too small to sustain faith when life falls apart. And it produces superficial Christians because they have never been confronted with the magnitude and the glory of the true God who governs sovereignly over all things. The church that faithfully preaches Romans 9, on the other hand, produces something entirely different. It produces profoundly humble Christians, because they know there is nothing in them that explains the mercy of God. It produces profoundly grateful Christians, because all the glory of salvation belongs to God, and this fills worship with a weight and a depth that the theology of free will can never attain. It produces profoundly secure Christians because their salvation is anchored in the eternal decree of God and not in the oscillation of human will. And it produces Christians profoundly committed to the mission. Because if God has an elect, people in every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, then the preaching of the gospel is not an attempt to persuade people to make a decision, but the calling of sheep whom the shepherd already knows by name. John Calvin preached Romans 9 without apology, not because he was insensitive to the difficulties the text raises, not because he was arrogant or oblivious to the pastoral impact of difficult doctrines, but because he knew that the people of God deserved the true God, not a more palatable substitute, not an edited version of the Scriptures, not a God domesticated by the culture of his time. They deserved the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, the God who has mercy on whom he will have mercy and hardens whom he will harden, whose ways are unsearchable and whose judgments are inscrutable, of whom and through whom and to whom are all things. The question that remains is not theological, it is personal. It is for you who have followed this series from the first topic to the last. Are you willing to know this God? Not the God of your comfort, not the God who confirms your choices and depends on your decisions, but the God of Romans 9, immense, sovereign, free, glorious, who acts for the glory of his own name, and whose grace is so radical that it leaves no room for human glory. This God is disturbing. This God destroys idols, including the theological idols we have built to make ourselves feel in control of our own salvation. But this God, and only this God, is worthy of total worship, worthy of absolute trust, worthy of a life entirely surrendered. And in the end, after everything, Romans 9 is not a chapter to be terrified of. It is a chapter to kneel before. If this content opened your mind, shook your convictions, and drew you closer to the true God of the Scriptures, then do one thing right now. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and hit the notification bell. Because there is much more content like this on the way. Serious, deep, unfiltered, and faithful to the Word. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about Romans 9. Because perhaps this is exactly the content God will use to open someone's eyes to the sovereign God the modern church is terrified to preach. Until next time.